And it's a particular pleasure because there hasn't been actually a lecture on Frank Lloyd Wright at the AA for some time. In fact, there may not have been an evening lecture on Frank Lloyd Wright since 1982 when Alan Brooks was here the last time. So it's very nice to see him again. I mean, it goes without saying the influence of Wright never quite disappears, and it resurfaces in sometimes rather unlikely place. And just a short anecdote, I was recently in Paris and I was having a conversation with an architecture critic, and this man, just to show how unlikely it can sometimes be, is or was a friend of Claude Parent and Paul Virilio in the 1960s, and also of Jean Renaudy. And he, at the same time in the 1960s, was absolutely obsessed by the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, so much so that at that time he went twice to the States and he visited 400 to 500 houses by Frank Lloyd Wright. And what's the point of his conversation when we spoke about this and other things was that the work of Wright never actually gets exhausted by analysis. It always resists analysis. And in our discussion, the way he actually talked about the work by Wright was that it was, in his mind, an early instance of morphing, just to show that the interpretation continues. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, today is resurfacing again with, I'm glad to say, Alan Brooks. And Alan has actually written or published 3 books on Frank Lloyd Wright. Perhaps the better known of them is a book called The Prairie House, which was published in 1972 and for which he received the Alice Davis Hitchcock Book Award. And this book is actually about not only Frank Lloyd Wright but also the whole Prairie School, many other architects who were practicing in a way which had connections with Wright. In addition to his work on Wright, Alan is really a major historian on the work of Le Corbusier. And he is the editor of the Le Corbusier archive, which includes no less than 32 volumes, a marvelous, I think, publication, which is in every library of architecture. And much more recently, he has actually published a book called The Formative Years of Le Corbusier, or rather Le Corbusier's Formative Years, 1997, and for which he again received prizes. The first prize awarded by the Association of American Publishers, and more unusually, I think, he was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in the category of biography. It is rather rare. Books of architecture history make it for a Pulitzer Prize, I believe. And since 1958, he was based at the University of Toronto, and he is now Professor Emeritus of that university. And I would like to say that he actually will give 6 lectures. This is the first, and there will be 2 more this week, which will be tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. And next week on Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday, those lectures will take place here, but not at 6:30, but at 5 o'clock. So I hope you actually join Alan for these lectures as well. So if you could welcome Alan Brooks.
Thank you very much. As just mentioned, this lecture I was asked to more or less deal with one subject, whereas the next lectures, the next 5 lectures, will go into greater depth in analyzing Frank Lloyd Wright's work, although this lecture is being devoted really entirely to an analysis of the young man, Frank Lloyd Wright, and how he synthesized the architectural world in which he lived, and how he brought something totally new to it. I mean, I consider that Frank Lloyd Wright brought to architecture as much as any man. I would rate him amongst the 5 or 6 greatest architects who ever lived. Now I know that will raise objections from a number of people, but I would put him along, starting with Ictinus in Greece up to the 20th century in the United States. But tonight what I'm going to do is primarily show you, and thinking that many of in the audience are students, how one at the age of 20 or 25 can analyze the architectural, the world around you, and how you can take from it the best features and create something which is new and indeed revolutionary and of great importance and great power. So we will start with Wright in the 1880s. Remember, he was born in '67. He really started his work in architecture at the age of 19. And I'm going to be spending first 2/3 of this lecture on Frank Lloyd Wright as really someone working in the age of the 20s, that is to say, the age of many of you people. We must remember that when Wright was born in the last third of the 19th century, that architecture had reached what he considered an impasse. We must realize that the specialization of architectural space had been going on for about 300 years. Some of you will recognize Charles Barry's work, Highclere on the far screen, late 1840s here in Great Britain. And in that we really see what architecture had become. It hadn't become the greater spaces of the Middle Ages, when you had a great hall and everyone congregated in the great hall for whatever the event was. By the 19th century, the house became very specialized. All these specialized rooms. As you see, you had a dining room, you had 2 libraries, you had a salon, you had an entrance, you had a drawing room, you had a waiting room, you had a dressing room, on and on. Each use had a separate room, and each room was enclosed as a box, that is to say, 4 walls with 4 corners. Now that is what Wright was to revolutionize. He was to get rid of those 4 corners, and I'm going to emphasize that point as we go along. Now Wright took a great deal from the American architecture of the 1880s. I mean, remember, he's starting about 86. He helped build a building in 86. He started making his first drawings in 87 when he was 19, 20 years old. And the next 2 slides shows you a smaller house, not a great manor like the Charles Barry design we saw a moment ago. Some of you may recognize Charlie Wood by Voysey here in Great Britain, 1900. I mean, there again you have each room with a certain specialty. Each room is a box, or the same thing was of course occurring in the United States. A building plan that was published in House Beautiful magazine in '99 that you see here. The usual combination of necessary rooms. You had your entrance. You always had a reception room. Receptions were very important at that time. The hall, the specialized rooms, but each one, of course, having the corners that defined the interior space of the individual room. Now, when Wright came on the scene, what was being published in the American periodicals was the architecture really of the firm of McKim, White, they were best known, and the work of Henry Hobson Richardson. We'll look at both of their types of work, and from both of them, Wright synthesized certain ideas, drew upon them, and then improved upon them. This is the house by McKim, White, the Isaac Bell House, 82 in date. All of these buildings I'm going to show you, non-Wrightian buildings, are from 1880 to 1886 in time. Here, McKim, White, I want to emphasize the plan. These houses were often called shingle style because on the exterior of the buildings they were usually shingles, as you can see. But this type of arrangement here, the entry, the reception room, doors which would close, this is what Wright was to completely change and completely reform. That is to say, instead of having a room here and a room here, which could be closed off, that Wright would integrate these two spaces in such a way that you gained visual privacy and yet had a great deal of space to work with. An example, the first house that Wright ever built for himself. This is his own house in 87. Tomorrow's lecture, when is the next lecture, tomorrow or day after, whenever it is, my next lecture, I will go back and discuss his training. He trained under two architects, Joseph Lyman Silsby and Louis Sullivan, in the firm of Adler and Sullivan. Now, when he was working for Adler and Sullivan, he got a monetary advance from Louis Sullivan and built his own house in Oak Park. And you can compare it with a house 3 years earlier that Bruce Price had built in Tuxedo Park, New York. And this is the Chandler House in Tuxedo Park. And the interesting thing about this house, I mean, Wright is, you might say, if you wish, he's almost copying this work. I mean, he never saw these buildings in their actuality. He saw them in the publications. They were all being published in the architectural journals, and you can see he's taken the Palladian window, used the Palladian window. He's using the equilateral triangle for the shape of the roof form. He's using bay windows as Bruce Price used bay windows. He's using the soft corner. In other words, there's no corner at the building here or here. I mean, he's picking up all these details, but there are things that he's changing. Immediately notice he's not using as many different materials. He's restricting the number of materials that he uses. There's no half timbering anymore. There's still the shingles, but shingles predominate. And this is something we will see increasingly in Wright's work, the elimination of many materials till the point in his advanced architecture where he would only use 3 materials in a building. It might be wood, brick, and glass. But going on from that, I want to look at this plan. We're going to come back to this plan several times in this lecture. We don't even know the exact date. It's a drawing he made when he went to apply for a job with Louis Sullivan. Therefore, we have to give it a date of circa 87. In other words, approximately when he was 20 years old, he made this project. And to me, it's a marvelous project. It's an incredible project because it really sums up everything that Wright was to do the rest of his life. And we can see the various sources that he used for it. I mean, for instance, later in life, of course, as we know, he used circular forms. Think of the Guggenheim Museum. He used angular forms, such as we have here. All of these things he developed later on in life, one at a time, as he synthesized these early ideas. But, and in the upper part of that, you could have noticed a carriage shed, and I'll come back to that carriage shed. Well, here's where he got the plan from. Here's McKim, White again. This is a house that he did in Lenox, Massachusetts. in the mid-'80s. And the plan, we're going to come back to the plan later, and let's take another house by McKim, Mead, and White. This one was in Far Rockaway, New Jersey. And these, of course, are the published plans that Wright saw. Then the next pair of slides, it shows you those two plans put together here and compare the plan in this project by Frank Lloyd Wright. But what's important about this plan is not that he cribbed certain ideas from the most famous architectural firm in America, but what he improved upon the work of McKim, Mead, and White. Now, if you, for instance, notice the order that he has brought to this plan, that whereas in these two plans by McKim, Mead, and White, I mean, if you look, figure out how this works. Oh, it's way up in the ceiling. Okay, notice the McKim, Mead, and White, the axis, there's no real axis that goes there. Notice the way Wright always brings axial organization to any interior or exterior space. See, Wright has an axis that goes right down here, and it has a focal point at both ends of the axis. Here, it has a window. See, in McKim, Mead, and White, there's no window. At the other end of this axis, he has a fireplace. He always likes to use a fireplace as the focal point. See, in McKim, Mead, and White, you just sort of careen off the edge of the stairs. The hall is in the middle, as McKim, Mead, and White put the hall in the middle. You might say there's the same type of angle going off here, and you notice the axis here, once again, goes directly into the fireplace. So he's organizing all of this axially in a way that McKim, Mead, and White had not done. Now, if we look at the same drawing again, I mentioned the carriage shed in the background, the stables in the background. Where did he get this idea? Any of you recognize the other work? Happens to be Henry Hobson Richardson. It's the Ames Gate Lodge in northeastern Massachusetts, 1880-81, again the early 80s. And I think there can be no question but that Wright has cribbed, if you want to use that word, the basic ideas. I mean, here we have the arched entryway to the gatehouse. I mean, of course, you go through here to get to the main house. The stables are here. This is where the stable hands and so on work, and so on. You'll notice here this semicircular form that Wright has, semicircular tower here. All of these elements you find in the Wright work. But what he's brought to it is something that he's going to use in his prairie houses. In fact, the stables that he shows here in the late 80s is really the prairie house of the early 20th century. The basic theme of it, something that's long and horizontal. Notice the way he even emphasizes the horizontal in the changed color of the masonry, just the way Richardson emphasized the horizontal with the way in which the masonry was treated in that case. And you can see in this case I've reversed the Frank Lloyd Wright drawing on this screen in order to show you the first drawing that Frank Lloyd Wright published in a popular magazine. This was published in the House Beautiful, which was, well, of course, House Beautiful still exists today as a publication. And you see all these same elements that Wright got from Richardson have gone into this project for a house in 1900, including the arched entryway, the long element here. The difference is he's made a porte-cochere at that point, the central living room and master bedroom projecting forward, all these basic elements that he's absorbed, and in a few moments we'll see how he got all of these together in Ward Willett's house 2 years later, 1902. So you see, he's basically synthesizing all these elements that existed in the best of American architecture at the time that he was doing his training. The far screen shows you the Ward Willets House 1902, which is basically a summation of that Ladies' Home Journal project. And in the 1 year in between, that is, say, 1901, here's the house he did. You see how he's working, he's fighting to get to the simplicity that you see in the far screen. Here we've got too many roof forms. They are somewhat different shape. This is a more complicated design. This is a house down it's a Bradley house down in Kankakee, Illinois. Now I'm going to spend some time analyzing a plan that Wright eventually used in that Ward Willets house. And once again, he's going back to the early 80s. This is another Bruce Price work in Tuxedo Park, New York, which Wright knew through publications by the same architect, Bruce Price, as the Chandler house that I showed you much earlier. This is called the Kent House. And here's the plan of the Kent House. And Wright was to take this plan and basically revolutionize the whole concept of several thousands of years of architecture. Now that's a big statement, but that's basically what Wright was to do with this concept of the plan. As you see in that plan, you are still dealing with your basic rectilinear spaces. You see each room has its corners, etc. And that's what Wright was to get rid of. In one stroke, it's really quite amazing. Now, here's the same plan that you were just looking at. The coloration of the terrace has changed, but it's the same plan. And here's a plan of the Ross house that he designed for Delavan Lake in Wisconsin in 1902. And what I used to always like to do at the School of Architecture was put this slide on the screen before my lectures began and have the students look at it for a while. And then I'd come into the lecture hall and say, has everyone seen this plan and knows what the plan looks like? And of course they would say, how stupid of me, and so on. And then I'd have this taken off the screen and I'd ask them to sketch the plan. I couldn't find one single student who could sketch this plan. They would all sketch this plan, which they'd never seen. Why? Because they miss the essential difference between what Wright has brought to this initial idea and created in this plan. All right, let's look at some of the differences. The most important one is, where are the corners of the rooms? Where's the corner up here between the living room and the dining room? The corner's gone. Where's the corner between here in the living room? Notice he's brought this French door, it's a glass door all the way down to the floor. He's brought this door right to this wall. He doesn't even have a jamb going in here, 6 inches as one would normally do. No, he's gotten rid of that. What's really left here? This is basically a slab. And I'm going to come back to that concept of a slab. Because the idea of releasing a wall from its corners allows Wright to move the wall wherever he wishes to. And he can put angles in it and change it around. This is how he came up with the Usonian house. How Mies van der Rohe, for example, came up with his brick country house in 1923. It all comes out of this concept. And Mies, of course, was one of the few architects who was generous enough to grant Wright the initial idea for so much of what he did. Well, I could tell you a wonderful story about Gropius. I'll do it in another lecture, though. Yeah, I have to tell you now. One time I wanted to find out, Wright's work was being published in Berlin in 1910, 1911, and this would go back to the late 60s and 70s, and I finally wrote Gropius, and I said, could I come down and visit you sometime? I want to find out more about exactly what was happening in the architectural world in Berlin in 1910. It was really very interesting, because I wanted to find out about an exhibition that was there. All of that material had been destroyed during the war or hadn't been refound after the war. And it was strange, because I found that Gropius was rather uptight on the subject of Wright, unlike Mies. Mies was always very open about Wright and granted him all kinds of thanks for what he'd taught. And every time I would talk to Gropius about did he see that exhibition on Frank Lloyd Wright and so on, he would sort of, like a good German general, get straighter and straighter and more upright, and I'd have to change the subject. I was afraid he'd throw me out or something. And after, then we went out to lunch and had a very nice lunch together. Finally came back to his office again, and he was sitting at his desk, and I was sitting beside his desk. And I mean, by then I'd been talking to him for, what, 3 hours or more. I finally asked him the question that I wanted to ask him initially, but I was afraid he'd throw me out. I finally said to him, did you ever know of that publication, Ausgeführte Bauten und Entwürfe von Frank Lloyd Wright? Buildings and Projects of Frank Lloyd Wright. It was published by Bosmuth in 1910. I expected him to sit up very straight and all the rest. Instead of that, he suddenly softened. He put his arm on my arm and said, oh, yes. Oh, I was surprised. And he said, you know, in 1910, I asked my mother asked me what I wanted most of all for a Christmas present. And I said, well, I would really like more than anything else a copy of Ausgeführte Bauten und Entwürfe von Frank Lloyd Wright. And he swiveled his chair around. He didn't even get out of his chair. And off the top of the bookcase, took this big folio and put it in my lap and said, and here it is. I was much too polite to say what was going through my mind. Going through my mind was the fact that he'd escaped Nazi Germany and somehow had managed to take this big folio on Frank Lloyd Wright with him to here, to Great Britain, and from Great Britain to Boston. And all those years, how many years would that have been? 45 or 55 years or something. He'd never let that book get further away than he could reach with his hand. But you realize he knew nothing about the work of Frank Lloyd Wright. He'd never been influenced by it, according to what he had to tell me. How can you care for a book that half of your life and never be away from it? Anyway, we'll get back to that in a later lecture when I look at some of Gropius's work in terms of what he took out of that book, such as the Cologne exhibition 1914 and so on, all of which, of course, owes a tremendous debt to Frank Lloyd Wright. But anyway, okay, so the important thing here is the fact that Wright is getting away from these corners, that the space here is interpenetrating. One space is overlapping and interpenetrating into another space, so that you can say, or I can ask you, if you're here, is that the dining room or the living room? You see, it no longer has an absolute value. It has a relative value, a value dependent entirely on the position of the beholder. Now that's terribly important. It's a totally new concept. So that if you're here, say in the dining room, looking in this direction, you feel the living room extends well beyond that space. In the same way, if you're in the living room, you don't feel that there's a corner there. Even if you're looking in this direction, you see there's not a corner because of the way he's treated the glass door. He's gotten rid of the essential element in interior architectural space, which is to get rid of corners. Of course, he hasn't got rid of all of them here, but he's certainly made a major step in that direction. These dotted lines, as you realize, suggest what's overhead. That's also important. Wright is always working in more than horizontal directions and vertical directions as well. Thus, if you're sitting here reading a book by the fireplace, the ceiling is lower. In the center of the room where you're standing up, the ceiling is higher. You'll see this in every single one of these Wright examples that I'm going to be showing you. How Wright manipulates ceiling height according to the activity that is taking place underneath the ceiling. Well, we'll come back to this slide at least 3 more times in this lecture. It's terribly important. Here it is again. Here is the type of thing that we saw in the McKimney white space, where you have a long room, and then you have, of course, keeping the corners. You shut off something. This was probably the living room, and that's the dining room. And then I compare it with a Wright space. These are the same dimensions. They don't look like it, but they're exactly the same dimension, these 2 rooms. But you see what Wright has done is to interpenetrate, as we saw the living room here, the dining room here, and look at the greater privacy that you get. When you're standing here, you can see a large portion of the smaller room, the dining room. If you're standing in the same place in a Wright space, you only see a small portion of the next room. In other words, what he's gaining is privacy and openness at the same time that he's overlapping these several spaces. I'm going to really drive that point home to you today. Now, this is one of the plates from Ausgeführte Entwürfe von Frank Lloyd Wright, the 1910 publication I was just talking about. I'm going to talk about, and this is the exterior of the building, which we saw a moment ago, the Ward Willis House of 1902. And the next slides that I'm going to show you, I'm going to do just a detail of the center of this house and show you how fantastic Wright's organization was for this interior. Basically, it's the same as the Ross house that we've just been talking about. And I showed you the Ross house first because it's easier. It's a smaller house. This is a more complex house. But see, you come in here. This is a porte cochere. You get out of your vehicle at this point, horse and wagon, of course, in those days, and you go up these few steps. You come into the house at this point, and next slide, we go into that detail. You come into the house, you see, at that point, and notice what the choices are. Now, you can see there are 2 choices. One is to go right, the other is to go left. Now, which way are you going to go? Now, naturally, you take the easier route. The easier route almost assumes that there's no maid there or no owner of the house to show you around. The easier route is this way, the reception room. You see, you don't immediately go upstairs. Stairs suggest privacy. Thus, Wright has introduced those few steps there to indicate that that's the more private part of the house. So you come in here, and these Wright houses you can almost go into with nobody there to greet you or show you around. It's the architecture which tells you how you are going to use the spaces in the building. All right, so you come in here, you go into the reception area. Eventually, you'll go up these steps. You notice these wooden slats at the top of the steps. You see, again, Wright is suggesting to you visually what lies beyond. In other words, it's not a blank wall here. Here's what you actually see, bookcase below. And as you mount those few stairs, you get above the bookcase and you see not only light, which is very important, But you see that the house extends a good distance in that direction. But, you see, once again, Wright is not going to let you go in that direction. He's going to prevent you from going. You get to the top of the stairs, and what do? This is tantalizing, but you can't go there. That is more steps, because the steps here lead to the second floor. You're not going to go up to the second floor. Therefore, you turn left, because over here there are French doors, a whole wall of French doors, lots of light streaming in this direction. You're going to turn left and come into this space. And then you see he repeats these same visual signals over here. Here are more slats across here. I'll show you a color photograph of it in a moment. And you can just see the hearth of another fireplace off here. And eventually you would come into what is the dining room. See, Wright is leading you by all of these means, by his architectural design, by light, by stairs, etc., into the parts of the house that he wants you to experience. Now here, the top of the stairs that we saw a moment ago are right here. Those slats would have been right here. So you would look through here all the way into the dining room. This is the fireplace in the living room. Here are those slats that show you the area of the fireplace near the dining room and so on. And if you walked all the way into the dining room and made a 180-degree turn, you see here you are looking back again. Here's the living room fireplace. There are those slats that I showed you in the last color photograph, the ones that you saw as you mounted the stairs. You see, none of this can you see when you're in the entry or when you're in the reception room of the house. And here is the fireplace for the dining room. Wonderful organization of this space to create a premium situation. Here's what we've just seen. You see, you come in the driveway, entry, reception room, you go up these steps, here are the slats, here's the living room fireplace, the slats we saw along here. You come into the dining room and you looked back, the last photograph was looking back this way into the house. Now, I like to make the comparison with the other slide. It's exactly the same year. It's designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's best friend, Bob Spencer, and Bob and Wright had desks next to each other in the same room. And I can't help but somehow wonder which one came first, whether Bob Spencer came up with this design and Wright looked at it and said, "Oh, come on, Bob, that's pretty menial," and designed this, or whether Spencer looked at this, and as most architectural students will look at this and end up drawing something like this. But see the difference. I mean, the procession that we've seen as you move through the space in the Frank Lloyd Wright house, and how all the axes in the Frank Lloyd Wright house work out. I mean, look at the axis, for instance, for your porte-cochere. You see, it isn't the same axis as the dining room. The dining room is on this axis, lined up with this fireplace. Again, going back to the subject of axes, they're always so important for Wright. And they're not monotonous. He isn't simply repeating the same axis on both sides of the house. He's varying it to give you some variety. I mean, look at the difference when you go into the Bob Spencer house. All right, so you come in here to the entry, you step through the door here, and you turn your head to the right and the left. You've seen everything. Leave the house. What more is there to see? You see, as long as you're standing here, you can see the library, the veranda, the dining room, the living room, the terrace, etc., etc. You see, you cannot do that in the Wright design, because Wright has developed his space in such a complex way that you have to move through these spaces in order to appreciate the difference of the interior. Now, let's look briefly at Corbusier. This is, of course, the house he designed in La Chaux-de-Fonds for his mother and father, 1912 in date, so we moved up 10 years in time. And here's the plan. Now, I believe that Corbu was quite aware of certain developments in American architecture at this period, and thinking of the so-called shingle-style planning that we saw at the very beginning with McKim, Mead, and White, in the openness of the interior. As you know, you come in here, there's a little reception hall here, coat room at this point, this is kitchen and all. You come in here, and you see on axis is the dining room at the far end. The only thing wrong with this plan, Corbu later introduced a fireplace, so there is a fireplace right against this wall. And this is basically the living room, the library, and a small sitting area here. But the idea of the T-shaped axis of the interior. But let's go to mature Corbu in the next pair of slides. You all know the Villa Savoie, and here, of course, across here is the living room. And it's marked here on the plan living room. Actually, it's not just the living room, it's the dining room and the living room. And look what Corbu has done in 1929 and 30. You see, Corbu has kept the corners of the room. Wright, you see, would have gotten rid of the corners of the room. And when you look from the dining area, see, here's the kitchen, here's the butler's pantry, the servants, and they did have servants, the servants would have served the meal through this door to the dining room table, which is here, as you'll see in my color photographs in just a moment. But you see, how much privacy has Corbu obtained in this fully mature work of his? Zero. I mean, when the owners are sitting here, here's the fireplace, they're sitting here at the fireplace or looking out on the terrace view. The maids come in, they can see the table being set, or they can see this table being cleared. There's no privacy at all gained in that interior space. Here are two of my shots of that area. Here's the dining room table, here's the dining room table again, and as you see, when you look through that room, here's the fireplace. The dining room table has no privacy in relationship to the living area of that house. Now, Wright faced that same kind of a problem. It didn't have to be a problem here, but for Corbu it was. That is to say, a long rectangular space. How do you gain privacy in terms of the mess of the dining room table and all of that, and the so-called privacy of the living area? And Wright achieved that brilliantly, of course, in 1907, 8, and 9 in the Robie House here in Chicago. Now, the central plan here shows Wright, well, you can see the site. I mean, here's the road. The house goes really basically right up against the sidewalk here. There are buildings right behind. It's a long, narrow lot. So how does Wright treat the long rectangular space? And here you can see, here's the dining room, here's the living room. But how did Wright keep privacy in that space? He put not only a fireplace in the middle of the room. Show me where the corners are in the living room. See, there are no corners here. And when I show you a color picture of the inside, you won't be able to tell me where the living room ends and where the dining room begins. It depends on the position and the viewpoint of the inhabitant. Again, architecture which is focused on the person within rather than on certain rules and writing down somewhere, living, dining, or whatever you want. Then you see the French doors go along here. The balcony, I'll show you a photograph looking through those French doors. I'll show you a photograph looking along the balcony. in just a few moments. But let's look at the interior of that space. All right, there we again have the diagram that I showed you before. Now that's what had existed, and that's what Wright inherited from his predecessors in American architecture. But what he did with it is this. You see, he put the fireplace in the middle. Now, who can tell me which of these French doors is in the living room and which of them is in the dining room? You see, it really depends on where you're standing. It's not an absolute space. It's a space dependent upon the position of the viewer. I admit I have trouble too. I rather expect this is the last French door in the living room. You see, I can't really tell, because these French doors go on and on and on, and you can't exactly tell which is the last door in the living room. The same is true of the treatment in the ceiling, though here it's a little bit easier. You can follow this wood member here and you can say, aha, there's the end of the ceiling. But what about this area? And here you see the same view with the Robies in the house. That's a photograph of about 1910, 1911. And in this case, because the photographer is standing further over from the fireplace, you see these French doors go on and on. You really can't tell. The space of the living room, he's gained all this space. He's given you this free space. You haven't even paid for it. You get all this extra space in there. And if you can't tell where things end along the side wall, where do they end overhead? Wright has opened up the fireplace. The flue goes up the side here, and you see that he's continued the roof form so that you realize that the space is going on. You not only realize the space is going on here, it's going on here, and notice what's happening overhead, just what I talked about earlier. Along the sides where you're going to be sitting, notice how high the ceiling is. In the center of the room, where you're more apt to be standing, walking, or if it's a cocktail party or something, the ceiling is made higher. It's being adjusted to the activity that is taking place underneath it. Well, the next two slides I'm going to show you, one is looking out, me standing up, looking out through these windows, and the other is going to be a photograph that I show along this little balcony here. And that balcony is worked out with absolute perfection. Next, please. Here you are standing in the living room, looking through these French doors. Isn't that wonderful? There's nothing but a garden there. Green grass, trees. You've got all kinds of privacy. But I thought this house was located right against a major street at the University of Chicago. And here's the major street. See there, the French doors would be here. Here's that little balcony. Here's the sidewalk. Cars parked on both sides of the street. People walking up and down the street. But look, you see none of that. Wright has gained complete privacy for the inhabitants of the interior of the house. I mean, this is sheer genius. It's wonderful. It's superb. And we'll come back to this subject in a future discussion. All right, now to leave that, but I'm going to pick up this theme of how Wright will use glazed windows to extend interior space. Now this is the typical American house of the period. We call them usually four-square houses because they're always square. They're the cheapest thing to build. Sometimes people would have a porch on front, and of course later on they'd sometimes enclose the porch. These four-square houses, I mean, there must be literally hundreds of thousands of them built in the United States. I mean, you go through a town and you'll just see hundreds of them in a single town. And what Wright did is took the theme of the four-square house, made it into something architecturally more pleasing to look at, and his contemporaries picked up this theme as well, and created something new. And you'll notice the windows that run along here, and they run along the far side. My slide showed the far side as well, just like we've seen at the Robie House, in other words. And if we look at the first example that Wright came up with, which again he published, here you can see the full page of the publication, fireproof house for $5,000. There's the house, basically, such as the little one in Aurora, Illinois, that we saw a moment ago. And here's the first floor and the second floor plan. Well, now the first floor plan I've enlarged here, make it easier for you to see, and see how Wright has taken this small four-square house, standard business of living room in front, dining room, kitchen, and so on, and used the same theme. And this is actually just before the Robie House, about a year or maybe 18 months before the Robie House. And you see what he has done along the side here, so that he has, instead of having a window here and a window up there, he's run the windows right along that wall, so that when you're in the living room, it's the same question. Where does the living room end? Where does the dining room begin? Or if you're sitting in the dining room, you look this way, where does the dining room end or the living room begin? And at the same time, you see how much privacy, even in this tiny little house, Wright has gained. If you're sitting in the dining room, looking in here, how much of the living room do you see? Really a very small portion of the living room, depending where you're sitting. But say you're sitting, well, even in that corner, you see, you would only see just a little bit of the living room. If you're sitting in the living room opposite the fireplace, you see, you don't see whether the table is set, there's no mess, and so on. You've gained privacy even in the smallest of interior spaces. And to me, this is, well, it's what Wright brought to architecture, sheer genius. Sorry to have knocked Corbu, but Corbu couldn't do such things. Here we come back to our old friend, the Ross house that I've talked about. And I spoke about how he'd gotten rid of the corner here. There's no corner up here. How this wall, therefore, becomes almost a slab attached only at one point. Same can be true of the wall on the other side. And look at the traditional house. The top image shows you the traditional room, that is to say, a room with its four corners. What Wright has done here is get rid of the traditional corners that have been had been associated with rooms for thousands of years, and therefore created simply these slabs to support the ceiling, the roof, and so on. But then the next question Wright asked is, why, if you no longer must adhere to having corners for every space, why keep these slabs of wall where they've traditionally been? You can move the slabs around. And this shows you what became, by the 30s in Wright's work, the Usonian house. The idea of simply taking sections of slabs and putting them in different spaces, places, in order to define the interior space of the house. This becomes a living room. This becomes a sort of small reading room or library area within the house. This becomes the dining room. This can be the kitchen or a little small study for workspace. This is obviously being opened up for the view. You see what Wright was able to do. Once he got rid of those corners and only had slab walls to do with, then he could play around with the slab walls and move them around to not to enclose space, but to define space. And that's the basic difference between traditional architecture and Frank Lloyd Wright's interior spaces. He is defining space. He is not enclosing space in the traditional sense. I mean, here's a typical Usonian house, is the Smith House in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. And of course, this is something we're going to be talking about in my next lecture, is the unit system that he uses in designing houses, beginning at the very beginning of his career, what he gets from his kindergarten training and so on. But that's a subject for another lecture. But see here, in the Smith House, he has gotten rid of those walls, even the slabs, so that he just has, you see that one section of the wall, this section of the wall is here in the plan. Another L-shaped piece of masonry is there. The dining area is here. Notice what's happened to the roof of the house. It's gone down. When you sit at a dining room table, you don't want a ceiling as high above you as you do when you're walking from one part of the house to another. So he drops the ceiling here. Here, where you're standing, enjoying the view and so on, the ceiling is higher. And we'll also notice in a minute, it doesn't come out well in this photograph, but here's the chimney. You notice this brick business here. His kitchen in these houses, you say, you're losing privacy. But what happens to things like odors from the kitchen, kitchen smells and so on? He changes the kitchen height to create basically a chimney out of the kitchen. So the kitchen is the highest room of the house, so that any odors will pass through the chimney and out above the chimney, out through the kitchen chimney, you might see. I'll show you a photograph of it in just a moment. That's this workspace that you see right here. And if we move inside, I'll show you two shots, one looking in each direction down the interior of the house. I mean, here's the entrance area, the fireplace. Unfortunately, you can't quite see here. It would be the hallway that leads to the dining area. I'll show you that in detail in a later lecture. Turning around the other direction, you see here's that brick wall that I pointed out here, another brick wall at this point. And you notice all the walls aren't of brick. What about this long wall? How is it supported? It's not the typical 2x4s balloon frame construction. Wright came up with a new way to support the wall between those brick elements. This brick, you see you've got brick here, and the next brick along that wall is here. How does he support it? He developed a sandwich wall, a very thin wall, plywood in the center, building paper on both sides of it, and then the same wood, again limiting the number of materials in any given house, the same wood on the interior as on the exterior of the house. We'll go into all of this in detail in a later lecture. And why doesn't this little thin wall bend or collapse? Who can tell me? This bookcase gives it structure. And by having these bookcase forms here, it gives that very thin wall enough rigidity so that it doesn't bend or doesn't collapse. I mean, again, brilliant solution to such a problem. Okay, enough. and I will go on with many of these subjects later on. I like this old cartoon. When I saw your bear last, it was near where the talking area flows into the eating area. You see, you can't even define a room anymore after Wright has created these types of spaces. You can only speak of areas, whether it be the talking area, the eating area, and so on. But, you see, Wright always retained privacy. In fact, in most cases, greater privacy than any architect prior to Frank Lloyd Wright was able to achieve. So here you see Frank Lloyd Wright in his more advanced old age, and I thank you very much for a pleasurable evening of discussing my favorite subject.
Yeah. So, Alan Brooks would be happy to answer some questions if there are some. But perhaps I could ask a first one. In the Ross House, you have showed the transformation for its prototype, so to speak, or its early model, which was a cross shape with 4 or 5 rather boxed out space. I wonder what kind of evidence has been left behind by Wright or possibly by others about what might have gone on in Wright's mind about pushing this central space in order to actually connect the 3 spaces which are now seeping into each other. In other words, well, I can understand the advantages in privacy, but were there other things to do with an aesthetic sensibility or to do with some appreciation of changes in the program of the house at that time, or what were the context of these changes?
Well, I think the program of the house remained the same. I mean, you still needed the same spaces, I won't say rooms. You had to have a place where you could receive your guests and entertain your guests, and where you could eat and so on. But I don't think that, I mean, of course, we don't know what was going on in Wright's mind. I'm sure that he was just trying to improve the concept of domestic living. Don't think that really answers your question, but in any case. Yeah.
You talked about the kind of flowing of interior spaces. We didn't speak much about aspect.
Access?
Aspect,
yes.
Presumably the orientation of these buildings were according to the aspect.
That's right. I didn't speak of it except in the case of the Robie House, how he achieved that privacy, even though it was close to the street. No, I didn't. More of that will come up in future lectures, but no, I wasn't trying to concentrate on aspect in terms of what you see from the house, except as...
I mean, they all seem to, all of the spaces work beautifully in terms of how you move through them, and I was wondering whether how they work so beautifully in relation to where the sun comes from, or which was north and
well, I mean, which was north and south, and all those things were very important to Wright,
sure.
But I mean, I didn't go through each house in terms of compass direction and so on. But I mean, I think what I said in terms of the Robie House is the most crucial thing. I mean, it was the most difficult aspect that he had to deal with. A busy street, and I'm going to show you later lecture other slides of that street and so on, and how he dealt with it. But I mean, where he was building most of his houses, which were not in the city. Robie House was an exception. It was right in heavily populated area. Most of his houses he built where there were several acres of open space for people, like the Like the Ward Willets house we saw, I showed it from the street, and the house is located way, way back, and you have several acres of land and so on.
But you also get the impression that the spaces of the house were kind of pushed back from the sunshine in a way, and they all have verandas and very deep eaves and things like that. So you're looking out.
Yes, of course he used deep eaves, but this is how he kept the hot sun of summer out of the interior of the house and allowed the welcoming sun of winter onto the interior. Yes, I mean, one can analyze the overhang of his roofs completely in terms of compass direction and season of the year. He was very, very careful about that. And it's interesting, I didn't bring any of them to London, but I do have photographs that I've made of certain houses in mid-December as opposed to mid-July, and shown where the shadow line falls on the floor of the living room type of thing. But I didn't have to bring any of those to London. But yes, he was very cognizant of that. Yes?
Do you, in some of the forthcoming lectures, go into some of the people that picked up on what Wright was doing and carried it perhaps even further? I mean, like Rudolf Schindler, for example.
Yes. I'm actually not going to show an example of Schindler's work, but okay. You were mentioning earlier, in fact, brought up to me some of those books. I mean, the contemporaries of Frank Lloyd Wright at this period I did in this book. The Prairie School, Frank Lloyd Wright and his Midwest Contemporaries, which I gather they've gotten several copies in the bookstore downstairs, which is, I think it's sold over 30,000 copies or something. It's just incredible. Of course, it's been published a long time. This book, Frank Lloyd Wright and the Prairie School, is really because the first book was primarily about Frank Lloyd Wright's contemporaries. I don't discuss Wright that much in this. I just discuss his impact on American architecture, that I more or less changed the focus for this book that I did for a museum exhibition, and concentrated on Wright himself. But yeah, all that, actually the contemporary, what Wright was doing at that period of time is something I will be mentioning in my next lecture. But I don't have time to deal with all his contemporaries. But the interesting thing about Wright, and this I'm going to bring out in the lectures, is that this whole early period that I was discussing today, that is to say, up until World War I, was tremendously influential in the United States, because it was largely reforming American architecture. And then during the late teens, in the 20s, and the 30s, and the 40s, Wright fell very much out of favor. Nobody paid any attention to him. Then in the 50s, like that, everyone started to copy basic ideas from Frank Lloyd Wright. I'll be showing you in a later lecture that. And they were called ranch-style houses. And there are tens of thousands, hundreds perhaps, hundreds of thousands of these ranch-style houses across the United States. That is to say, L-shaped, one-story high, low-pitched roofs, on and on and on. All these things that had been learned from Wright. And what does surprise me today is how I mean, any house you go into today in the United States, the most appropriate book to have on your coffee table is, of course, one about Frank Lloyd Wright. He's so in fashion. But, you know, he isn't taught in those places. How many, Mawson is left. How many design courses do you have here at the AA that emphasize or even touch on the work of Frank Lloyd Wright? I wouldn't be surprised if you told me none at all. I remember a few years ago lecturing at the School of Architecture at George Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. And I went through the drafting rooms, and all the students had pinned up different drawings and photographs of Wright's work, and I finally spoke to one who had a lot of photographs of Wright's work around. And I said, "Oh, I'm delighted to find that the faculty here discuss the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, and that you are picking up some of the ideas from his work." And the students said, "Oh, no, oh, no." And I said, "What do you mean, oh, no?" He said, "I would never include an idea of Frank Lloyd Wright's work in my own designs." I said, "Why?" "Well, the surest way to get a C- or a D in the course is to include an idea of Frank Lloyd Wright's." And I have found that to be true over and over and over again. I don't know, I'll have to ask some of you people the next few days whether it is still true here at the AA. And I think one of the reasons is that type of analysis that I just gave you this afternoon. I don't think that 1 out of 50 architectural critics could give that kind of a lecture, maybe 1 out of 100 or 1,000. I've talked with so many crits who teach in schools of architecture, and they haven't a clue as to about what I was talking about this afternoon. I don't think they teach it because they can't understand it. And to my way of thinking, I find it very easy to understand, but maybe too easy. Maybe some of you will object. No, I find that's why Frank Lloyd Wright is not welcome in schools of architecture. Mies is welcome. I mean, anybody can teach Mies. It's so teachable. Frank Lloyd Wright is not teachable. It's very different. In fact, I should have brought in a quote from Philip Johnson, who's written a good deal on this, and said that the problem with Frank Lloyd Wright is he's the greatest architect of the last 100 years, but he's impossible to teach. He's just too profound. Don't get me off on that subject. Let's have another one. Yes.
Do you, I mean, because you know the work so well, do you see any principal failings in Wright's work? Does he have an Achilles heel of some sort as an architect?
Well, one that most architects have. He always ran over budget. But in addition to running over budget, you name some of them and I'll see whether I agree or disagree. What? Oh, I mean, you know, everyone complains, and I noticed the write-up for my lectures here. It said something about Wright being I was going to say words I shouldn't say. What was the write-up? Something about his personality and so on. Yeah, but he got wonderful publicity because of it. And luckily I knew Frank Lloyd Wright. And I have a very different attitude towards his personality. I mean, he was always so wonderful to work with and to deal with. I didn't work for him as an apprentice. I was doing my doctoral dissertation not on Frank Lloyd Wright, which embarrasses me to this day. I was doing a doctoral dissertation on his contemporaries, on the people who'd trained in his office and who we didn't think were very good architects. And yet he was always generous with his time to talk about these men who he thought were second-rate architects by comparison with his own work. And in comparison with his own work, if I say he's one of the 5 or 6 greatest architects that's ever lived, I'm placing him pretty high. No, I just found him just I remember one time I had talked to him for a couple of hours, and I was about to leave Taliesin, and so I said, "Hey, Mr. Wright, how about a tour of Taliesin? He looked at me and he said, but Alan, I gave you a tour the last time you were here. So I stood up and took a couple of steps towards the door, turned around and said, okay, Mr. Wright, if you don't think your architecture is worth a second look, never mind. Boy, did I ever get a tour. It lasted for hours, every inch of Taliesin. No, I found he had one thing that really is important to me is having learned from my acquaintance with him was that he had a wonderful sense of humor. And he and I could crack jokes back and forth. This is something I've never read anywhere. I've never read anything ever written which says Wright had a sense of humor.
The students the people, architects I know that went to Taliesin, quite a few, California, all of them seem to be kind of third-rate Taliesin people. They don't seem to rise out of that. And I've never known one who didn't do that.
It is true. Well, would you put Lautner in that?
No.
No, but you see, Lautner is someone who, or Alden Dow. How about Alden Dow? All right. I mean, so there were a few who could rise above it. And I almost included a few of Edgar Taffel's designs in this series of lectures, and then I finally left the slides at home. I decided I shouldn't do that. But to show how one who studied decades under Wright could not find how to put things together in a quiet, restful way. Oh, now I'm sorry I didn't include those slides. Because that's one thing about any of those Wright buildings you get into. I mean, it's so relaxing. You just completely relax. I don't want to knock Corbu again, but you know, anytime I stay at the what am I trying to say in Marseille? Unité d'habitation in Marseille, in one of those hotel rooms, or when I stay with friends who are living in various Corbu buildings. Actually, the one Corbu building that I enjoy staying in and find comfortable in is the Swiss Pavilion, Pavillon Suisse, Cité Universitaire in Paris. There I can relax, but in most of Corbu's buildings, I feel pressed. I feel the walls coming in on me. Whereas in Wright's buildings, when I take my students to buildings, I really like it. In some cases, the owners go out to dinner, and what I do is bring my students, say, at 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and we'll just stay in the building until long after dark, and just experience it through different light conditions and all the rest. No, they're so relaxing. No, I just find it incredible. Yeah. And I like working on early. This is why, well, as you see, I emphasize the early Wright today. Well, it's normal, first lecture. But I like working on formative people, formative lives. I mean, I would like to have spent more time working on Frank Lloyd Wright. I switched over for various reasons to Corbu. But see, I took the same approach with Le Corbusier. I mean, my book, Le Corbusier's Formative Years, takes him up to his 32nd birthday, when he finally takes the pseudonym Le Corbusier. And the reason I find that fascinating to deal with is, again, it's that same period with Le Corbusier, those formative years when he is absorbing and synthesizing the architecture world around him, and what he takes from Peter Behrens, and what he takes from German architecture. I mean, this is why I hated German architecture later on in life, because he took so much from it. But no, I find it interesting to deal with student, you might say, the student life of great architects. That's why I like lecturing to people like yourselves. Any other questions? Okay. Well,
Well, maybe we take one last question. Yeah.
Can I just say a few words of thanks? I chose to come tonight because I don't think I can come to any other of your talks, unfortunately. And I thought it was a very appropriate way of celebrating my 75th birthday, which is today. And I was quite right, because Wright, like for so many who are here tonight, I imagine, has been a god for me. And in the early 1970s, I gave a talk in the series The Architect's Approach to Architecture, which the RIBA held every winter at that time. And I detailed what I thought had been my influences. And Wright featured large. And in fact, I showed the Johnson Wax office as one of the illustrations. And I was very minded of Gideon's, I think it was Gideon's description of being in that fantastic space where he talked about the quality of the light. And of course, the quality of light is one of the elements, surely, of architecture. And I wonder how much it is regarded these days when I look at the sort of productions which are being meted out by many of those of high profile in the architectural magazines these days. There was no question that Wright's use of light was absolute magic. And there were a number of other things that were absolute magic. His use of stained glass, and as you pointed out tonight, something I hadn't really realised myself, which was a sort of dematerialisation of the corner, and these wonderful vistas which implied that you must move through the spaces as well as enjoying them by sitting in them and doing whatever you were intended to do in the spaces. So to have known Wright must have been absolutely a trembling experience, and I do thank you very much for a very unique occasion, at least in my life.
thank you.
Okay, well, on those good words.
Okay, speaking of corners, one last thing. The most often photocopied words of mine are always those that deal with an essay I wrote in a book that I did. It's called Writings on Wright, obviously a pun. Writings on Wright, it's MIT Press, and I'm sure they have it in the library, and I know they have it downstairs in the bookstore. But it's a short essay, and basically it deals with all of this that I was talking about with regards to the Robie House and the Ross House, and those diagrams I showed you are all in that book. And I'm just surprised wherever I'm lecturing, I find that that's the article that most, in fact, the royalties I get from photocopies of that article are really quite surprising. It's used in architectural schools literally around the world. That's basically that business of getting rid of the corners in architecture. Okay, thanks very much. See you tomorrow.